In the beginning, I will present all people here on the scene. I will start with Marci Shore at my right hand, who will deliver a short or long, we will see how much time she will consume, a lecture on the topic. She's an historian. She teaches European intellectual history, has a master from the University of Toronto, holds a PhD from Stanford University, and since a couple of years she's at Yale. Where we met 2 years ago, I guess. And she's focusing, as I already mentioned, on the intellectual history of 20th and 21st century in Central and Eastern Europe, as of course language qualifications, and I will just mention a few publications, not this all list, because we will use our time to discuss and not to mention all our academic achievements. One thing which I like, and that's the reason why I'm mentioning it, she translated Michał Górzyński. Probably nobody knows him, but he was a very famous Polish author, from Polish into English. His diaries, I guess, or his memoir, yeah. And which leads us a little bit more into the topic of today's evening. She published a book, The Taste of Ashes, the Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and a further book, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. And of course, as an American professor, in the summer she's traveling to use the term break to visit various countries of Europe, and she's regularly a visiting fellow at the Institute of the Wissenschaft vom Menschen in Vienna. And at my right hand, you can see Vasyl Cherepanyn. He's what you probably reconnect already with his name. He is from Ukraine, right now living in Berlin since less or more 1 year. And he's the head and co-founder of the Visual Culture Research Center in Kiev. It was founded in 2008 as a platform for collaboration of academics, artists, and activist community. He holds a PhD in philosophy and taught at the Kiev Mohyla Academy at University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder, in Helsinki at the Freie University in Free University in Berlin and elsewhere, and created, which is also interesting because it underlines the interdisciplinarity of our podium here. He created several exhibitions. I will just mention two: the European International at Rijksakademie in Amsterdam, and Armed Democracy in 22 at the second edition of the Biennale in Warsaw, and of course further things. The procedure will be the following. Marci will deliver a lecture. We will comment shortly on that, maybe a few questions, short discussion among us, and then we will hand over to the public. And of course, we encourage you to be maybe not aggressive, but critical, questions, comments. My former boss would say attacks. Okay, Marci, the floor is yours, please.
Geht's op? Ja. Okay. Oh, ich freue mich sehr, hier zu sein. Vielen Dank für die Einladung. Ich fühle mich immer schuldig, wenn ich Englisch spreche in einem anderen Land. Es gibt so viel von dieses englische Sprache-Imperialismus. Also, Entschuldigung. I will, let's see, the lights are bright, but I will try to speak clearly and not too fast. If it's not comprehensible, just look confused and I'll slow down, or I can subject you to my bad German if necessary. Say my children are native German speakers, and they tell me all the time how many mistakes I make when I speak German, so I'm very aware of it. And thank you to Kim for the invitation. I already feel much more fashionable than usual being in this very hip space. So first, I want to say a word about how this topic came to be. The title, as you might have noticed, comes from an essay by Victoria Amelina, and on the difficulty of inviting ghosts for breakfast. And Victoria, Vika, was one of the best authors of her generation and one of the bravest women of her generation. She was killed in a Russian missile attack in Kramatorsk last year. And one of the last essays she wrote before she was killed, she wrote at a very special place called the Borderland Foundation in Krasnogruda, all the way up north in Poland on the Polish-Lithuanian border, not far from Belarus, in a place that had often been soaked with blood and now is soaked with art and music and theater. It's a center for dialogue. And Vika wrote an essay there called "Nothing Bad Has Ever Happened." And that is in some way a provocation or a satire of the place that she herself comes from, which is Lviv, which is a city she loves and is absolutely committed to and was committed to the moment she died, as she was committed to Ukraine. And she wrote this essay saying that if we want this place to be our home, and if we really love it, we have to look at the past with eyes wide open. We have to look at this city in all the layers of its tragedy, and all the layers of its cruelty, and all the layers of its dark past, and all the ways in which the many different people who have inhabited this place sometimes have helped one another, and sometimes have harmed one another grotesquely. And she says a true home is a place where you invite the ghost for breakfast. It's a short essay. Normally she wrote in Ukrainian. She wrote this in English. It is in a way a kind of provocation for discussion. And for me, it's short. In some ways it's simple, but I think it's one of the most important texts that's come out during the war. And I think one of the most important points of departure for Vergangenheitsbewältigung in Ukraine. And so the title comes from Vika. That the only way to overcome alienation is ultimately to look at the past with eyes wide open. And it also reminds me of something that a friend of mine from Russia said, Elena Kostuchenko, who is one of the bravest Russian journalists and was the victim of a poisoning attempt by the FSB, which she survived, although she's still quite weak and now a bit on the run. But she came and spoke to us at Yale last year about the writing she's done about Putin's Russia. And she said that, this is my country, and I love these people, and because I love these people, I have to face the evil, and I have to write about that evil clearly. And she said, love demands a very precise look at what you love. Love demands responsibility. And those two remarkable women, I think, give us a kind of important point of departure for looking at the way that the past inflects the present and looking at the way that our ability to grapple with that past affects the present. I want to go back now to the last time I was in Russia, which was in 2016. And at the time, I was working on a book about the Maidan, about the revolution on the Maidan in 2013, 2014. And it was very important to me that before I published that book, I go back to Russia and I sit in the same room with my Russian colleagues and I look them in the eye and I really try to understand what's happening there. And it already wasn't that easy for me to go at that point. My husband and I had both been very publicly engaged on behalf of Ukraine, and the risk of going to Russia and the difficulty of getting the visa was non-trivial. But I had an occasion to go in fact, because of work that was done in your country, because of a collection of German Stiftungen, in particular the Fischer Stiftung, who was organizing a series of conversations under the title Debates on Europe. And they were a series of conversations that these German organizations were running in collaboration with local partners in various former Soviet republics. And so this one was in St. Petersburg, and it was really a German-Russian conversation. The elephant in the room, the missing people, were the Ukrainians. Serhiy Zhadan, the Ukrainian author who had been the host when they did a previous iteration of this in Kharkiv, couldn't come because he was on the list of people to be arrested in Russia. And then several other of our Ukrainian colleagues declined to come because they also might be arrested. And then the Germans understandably got nervous and thought the rest of the Ukrainians shouldn't come, which offended a lot of people, although I have to say I was very sympathetic, because the last thing you want to do when you're organizing a conference is invite people and then they get arrested and you're completely helpless because it's not your country. And the last thing I wanted to do was see any of my colleagues get arrested in Russia. But it was a strange conversation, because in many ways it was about Ukrainians without Ukrainians. And I was the only American, so I was kind of an eavesdropper in a certain way. So it was generally Germans and Russians sitting in a room, talking very intensely for 3 days. And the topic of the conversation was essentially who should apologize to whom. And the Germans felt like, okay, we have apologized for Nazism. Now it's time for the Russians to apologize for Stalinism. And this is, of course, precisely what has not taken place in Russia. And there was a lot of shouting, and a lot of emotion. And one of the things that the Russians were saying is, so I should apologize on behalf of my dead grandmother who herself suffered so much under Stalinism and under Nazism as well. So to apologize on behalf of my dead grandmother is to betray her after her death. And it raised the issue of the difficulty of facing the past when there is no clear line between the victims and the perpetrators. The German case, your case, was in some ways simpler. You were either an Aryan or you were not an Aryan, and the line between victim and executioner was fairly clear. It was not so clear in the Russian case. To live through Stalinism was to have been both a victim of Stalinism and someone who was implicated in Stalinism. And there has been no real coming to terms with that. The failure of Vergangenheitsbewältigung has taken a different form in Russia. And one thing I noticed listening to the Germans and the Russians yell at one another, and I think in both cases there's a failure of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, a different failure in both cases. I felt like the question was not being posed in the right way, because everybody was talking about guilt and shame and apologies and repentance. And the word repentance in Russian, pokayanya, has this very heavy religious undertone. And I felt like nobody was actually talking about verstehen. I felt like nobody was actually saying, okay, we have a room now full of Germans and Russians. We're talking about Nazism and Stalinism. Can we look closely at what happened? Under what circumstances and what conditions was it possible for human morality to completely break down? What were the conditions that allows this kind of cruelty and this kind of terror? And isn't the question we should be asking, how can we look at that? Look at that as clearly as possible and try to understand how it happened. Not so that we can accept the guilt of our grandparents and our dead grandparents, but so we can take responsibility for not letting it happen again. And one of the things I see in this failure, in the Russian case, to look at the past with eyes wide open, is that it's a failure, not that it's a failure to accept guilt, but it's a failure to accept responsibility. It's a failure to accept responsibility for the present, and it's a failure to think of oneself as a responsible agent, as an actor and not a passive object, as a subject and not an object. This is what has fallen apart. And that I think that the insights that people like Sergei Lebedev have had about the failure to confront the past as being at the essence or the key to understanding the pathology of contemporary Russia, I think that's very much on point. Arkady Ostrolsky, who is a wonderful journalist and The Economist based in London, a native Russian speaker, he says in his podcast, he said, "It was not February 2022 when I first realized that something catastrophic was about to happen." He said it was December 2021 when Putin liquidated Memorial. When he liquidated the human rights organization that was also devoted to uncovering and documenting the crimes of Stalinism. When he liquidated Memorial, I understood that now it was over. Now we were about to jump into an abyss. And I think that was a very prescient insight. Of course, since I'm here in a German-speaking place, there's a motif here of Freud's Die Wiederkehr des Verdammten. The repressed always comes back. You can't make it go away. And that's connected to this failure of selfhood. I want to also say a few words, and I realize I'm on shaky ground here because I'm in Germany, about what I see are some of the failures of Vergangenheitsbewältigung in the German case. One is that I think there has been a conflation of Soviet with Russian. And I understand that the legacy of accepting guilt with respect to the Second World War has given many Germans a feeling of owing a debt to Russians. But I think it's important to remember that the Soviet Union was not only Russians, and the Red Army was not only Russians. And in fact, the bloodiest places to be during the Second World War were in the Belarusian Soviet republics, and the Ukrainian Soviet republics. And that Red Army included people from all Soviet republics. And so I would say Russia in that case, and particularly in this case, is a misleading shorthand for the Soviet Union, given how many Ukrainians and Belarusians the German army also killed. I would also say that the very honorable desire to accept guilt in the German case has often been performed as a kind of reluctance to pass judgment on Putin's Russia. And here again, I think this is a conflation of repentance and understanding, because the neo-totalitarianism that has arisen in Putin's Russia is not something that should not be judged. And that's been accompanied by something that the Americans also very much fell under, which was a kind of 1989 Francis Fukuyama-esque delusion about the end of history. The sense that the Wicked Witch was dead, and now we replace one Hegelian narrative with another Hegelian narrative, and now we know that there's a liberal teleology of progress, and we are all moving inevitably, inexorably towards liberal democracy. And there was a sense, and that was very much equally as true on our side of the Atlantic, that democracy, liberalism in the sense of respect for individual rights and political freedoms, and free market neoliberalism were all part of this utopian capitalist package. This is where the idea of Wandel durch Handel comes from. That we engage people, in free market economic relations, and that has a domesticating effect on them. That just kind of naturally leads people in this direction towards liberal democracy. And I was very much under the sway of that narrative as a young person as well. And if February 2022 has meant something in the context of that history, it is the decisive failure of that narrative. We now know that there is no end of history. The end of history has come to an end. There is no natural liberal teleology of progress. There's no reason why free market neoliberalism is naturally going to lead people to behave well. I would also say that the German feeling of guilt has led to an understandable inclination towards pacifism, which as a former pacifist activist, as a young person who most of my life thought of herself as a pacifist, I'm also very sympathetic to. It's often taken the form, German guilt has often taken the form as a retreat into a kind of quasi-pacifist passivity, a reluctance to act, which at this particular moment strikes me as having tragic consequences. So let me just make a couple further points. One, I want to make a kind of philosophical point, and I'm a historian of ideas, so normally I don't talk about contemporary politics. Normally I talk about philosophy. And my best German vocabulary is talking about phenomenology and Heidegger, but I'm sparing you that right now. The difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is contingent. Guilt is dependent upon something that one did or did not do. In philosophical terms, guilt is a posteriori. Guilt is after the fact. One is guilty of something one did or failed to do. And the philosophical point I want to make is that responsibility is very different. Responsibility is not a posteriori, it's a priori. It's immer schon in Heideggerian terms. It's always already. We are always already responsible. The source of that responsibility is not guilt. It's not our guilt. It's not original sin in a religious sense. It's not what our grandparents might have done or might have not done. The source of the responsibility is in der Welt sein. Wir sind immer schon in der Welt. Dasein ist immer schon mit sein. The source of the responsibility is the fact that we are in this world. It's a priori, there's no escape, it's not dependent on anything else, it's not contingent. Now let me just end by, this is going to be a little bit of an introduction to Vasyl. Vasyl and I have spoken, we've spoken with Stefan as well, in the past couple years about risk, and Vasyl's written about this. What does it mean to take a risk? What does it mean for the West to have to take a risk? And Vasyl says either the West is going to take a risk now, or not. And I'm one of the most cowardly people I know. I'm terrified of violence. I'm also terrified of snakes. I spent a lot of my life as a pacifist. I grew up in a Jewish community in the United States with Holocaust survivors being taught at Hebrew school by Holocaust survivors. When I was 17, I went to Abby Hoffman's memorial service. I don't know if anyone remembers who Abby Hoffman was. Somebody is nodding. He was one of our great revolutionary peace activists of the 1960s. I went to his memorial service in 1989 after he committed suicide wearing peace sign earrings and a tie-dye t-shirt. My great-grandparents were victims of pogroms at the hands of Ukrainians. And so I have all sorts of reasons, that one would think not to be arguing that we should immediately intervene in Ukraine and give them weapons and permission to use them. But now, as a middle-aged Jewish mother, and without having actually, I think, fundamentally changed my values, I find myself in this surreal situation of pleading on both sides of the Atlantic for lethal weapons immediately to be sent to Ukraine, and for the restrictions on them to be lifted. Not despite my own background, but in some ways because of it. Because I grew up with and saturated with an understanding of the Holocaust, because I'm a historian of 20th century totalitarianism. And also, and this is the last point I'll end with, because in many ways I'm a Russophile. I miss going to Russia. I love Dostoevsky, and I have not taken him off my syllabi since this war started. I miss speaking Russian, which I speak badly, but I love passionately, and understandably no one wants to speak anymore. I love my Russian friends. And I think anyone today who cares about Russians at all, even let's put the Ukrainians aside, anyone who cares about that world at all, the only way to help anyone is to help the Ukrainians defeat Russia. Because Putin will burn through all of that country's resources, and he will bleed through his entire population until he's defeated. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about other people's lives. And when you don't care about other people's lives, that gives you an incredible advantage. Because then really, in Dostoevskian terms, everything is permissible. Then there are no constraints. And I'm watching my Ukrainian friends and colleagues be slaughtered, and I'm watching hundreds of thousands of Russians be slaughtered. And it's like we have a live stream into the gas chamber. We're watching it all in real time. We know what's happening. Everybody knows what's happening. And so I'm here to make a plea, both that we look at the past and try hard to understand where things have gone so grotesquely wrong, and to do everything we can to try to take the responsibility now and to take a risk and to act. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marci. I would first ask Vasyl ask for a short comment, and then I will also deliver a few words. It should be, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much. First of all, my name is Vasyl Cherepanyn. I'm representing I'm one of the co-organizers of the Kyiv Biennial. So first of all, I would like to express my deep institutional gratitude to our colleagues from Pochen Biennale for having me here. I appreciate this solidarity action, as I treated indeed a lot, and thank you, Marci, for your point. So I would just really very shortly try to outline a few points that I had in my mind in that regard. But first of all, I also have to say that since I'm the only one on the panel here from Ukraine, and having been participating in a myriad of events throughout the last 2.5 years or so in various foreign contexts, I have also a feeling that it became kind of natural that people from Ukraine are like commenting on the war. And but what I would like to stress, especially here, that it's totally not natural, not at all, right? I mean, me, as well as my colleagues, artists, cultural practitioners, curators, university teachers, could have been busy and dealing with totally different topicalities. It's not natural that we have to deal with the war. We are not the warriors. We are not like born to survive, to fight, and to deliver whatever we have for the cause. It's more or less like you here, right? So it's basically it's by occasion that we are stuck in this. So I would love to speak about absolutely different topicalities that I had been dealing with as a university teacher, as a curator for many, many years. But it's just it's a kind of a trap that was imposed by an aggressor, right? That I have to comment on this. So, because I have this feeling that pretty often in the West it's kind of very naturalized that there are nation states that are in a way predestined to deliver and to speak about that, which I find pretty weird, to be honest. But my first point would be that I think, like what Marci brought up here, is very much dealing with like the very concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, right? It's very much dealing with how we cope with the past, whether we have an ability to tackle the past. But I would rather, so it is of course, it's not even a concept, I would say, that especially in this country, it's very much kind of an established ideology, right, which has been developing very broadly and also and very much imposed on the east of Europe throughout the last 30 years or so. And I think that pretty often we actually forget to ask quite simple questions, whether we in general, do we deal with the past? What do we deal with, first of all? Is it the past that we are dealing with? And what kind of past we are dealing with? And I have this feeling that I think what has to be introduced as a kind of additional surplus value, so to say, to the discussion here would be the basic differentiation between history and memory, which I think is very fruitful to keep in mind. Because I think like this discussion that unfortunately is very much also projected onto the Ukrainian context, but I think it has a global dimension, which is that which reminds me, if I'm not mistaken, it was Nietzsche who put it that what unites us is not what we remember, but what we together decided to forget. Right, and I think like this international or in a way global trend that we have been observing throughout the last years, especially, well, around 10 years or so, has been very much about shifting to some illusionary past. Right, we have many variations of this trend. Be it we can repeat from the Kremlin side, or make America great again from you know whose side. So, but this fascistoid sort of pseudo-conservative neo right-wing shift has been very much defining how we speak about the past and, for that matter, about ourselves. So, in this sense, I think that since this war, Russian-Ukrainian war, is started, as you of course know, in 2014 with the annexation and the occupation of Crimea, is just a full-scale stage that took place 2.5 years ago. So I think that this type of discourse has been a kind of the other side of the coin, which has war and fear as its other side. So I think this memory, so-called politics, goes along with the war developments in Ukraine, but very much beyond, together. That basically it's so the war machinery. It's the politics. It's a necropolitics, right? It's a politics where dead bodies are used as weaponries, where history is weaponized, right? As we know from the argumentation from the Kremlin side. So when and the war machinery is basically producing in incredible numbers dead bodies, which are actually used to fuel the memory machinery that we are sticking to. Secondly, I think this idea, this quotation from Amelina that Marci mentioned about inviting ghosts to the breakfast, I find it particularly useful and interesting, because I think that the figure, even in terms of the visual culture studies but also even speaking artistically, as we are in the art context, I think this figure of a ghost is has a particular importance, and it can also explain to us, when we look to it at it closely, the current pan-European predicament, in particular the German case, why in terms of how the broader context has been reacting to the outbreak of the war and the incredible atrocities that has been happening. Because on the one hand, the idea of the ghost, or so in that sense, I perceive the European Union, or the idea of United Europe, as a kind of a haunted house. Right, like a collective haunted house, which on the one hand we are all claiming that we are dealing with the past, but at the same time it seems like something went wrong, because otherwise it wouldn't be haunted. Right? So the very idea of the ghost appearance is an indicator that something went wrong, because the concept of the ghost basically means that there is an entity which doesn't exist but used to, which demands some recognition, that something went wrong but is not recognized as wrong, right? And that's why it's so intrusive, that's why it's so obsessive, that's why it doesn't have its own meaning, but it's so it's not present, but it's constantly visiting, right? That's what, as we know from Hamlet and Shakespeare, right? What was called, it's a very much a chronological or chronotopological issue. That it's a problem of time. Something has gone wrong with the time in Europe, if this war became possible. Something in the time perception of history, perhaps, has broken in some sense, if this war appeared to be possible and was basically, to be honest, allowed to happen. Right? And this chronotopological issue is what Shakespeare called when the time is out of joint, right? When there is a kind of a broken time, that there is a gap, a kind of a missing point, that something is not coherent, that it's not fluent, that there are ruptures in time. But what are these ruptures? And I think that this very much also explains why the very idea of Europe, which has been from the very beginning and very much based, of course, on the common responsibility for the atrocities of the Holocaust, very much, especially in the western part of it, that being so much obsessed with history, with time, and so much arguing about that, at the same time it's constantly late, right, in reaction. If you think, even it doesn't even matter actually, because I don't want to make any kind of pro-Ukrainian sort of propaganda, so to say, but even it doesn't matter if you support or you don't weaponry deliveries to Ukraine, but in general, if you step back a bit and think of it in, I mean, also myself included in a way, it's quite weird, right, that in order to trigger the next set of economic sanctions, you first need a mass grave. Isn't it strange, right? It's a kind of a strange, broken, kind of a wicked logic that you need to have a pile of corpses in order to do something, right? Why not prevent something from happening? But why do you only react, then act? I mean, in general, this is even in terms of self-reflection, even on the individual level, this is quite strange, I find it, right? I mean, also, Ukraine has also to be perhaps blamed for many, many cases, and for that matter. But I think in general, this is quite perverse, quite weird. And I think especially in the German case, if you let me just mention few things in that regard. I think there are several reasons, if I may speculate about that, why it has been so. With regards to this belatedness, and it's a kind of a threefold, I would say, reason which develops, which actually deals not only with the 20th century and not only with Nord Stream 2, but I think that first of all, as we are in Eastern Germany, I think what again I'm speaking from the other side of the wall, so to say, from it's a kind of a acousmatic Ukrainian voice here, but being in the former East Germany, I think this DDR experience. As it was, if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of the 90s, there was an expression, DDR had nie gegeben, so it has never existed, this type of attitude. I think this type of Merkelism politics, which defined this country for quite some time, had really a very important impact on the German outlook in terms of in the context of the EU, but also very much beyond, especially towards the east of Europe, towards the so-called post-Soviet East Europe. And you have here a kind of a very perverse, again, overlapping that on the one hand, this part of Germany, which, by the way, I have to also say that from the Ukrainian perspective, having disrupted borders, right, having violated borders. Germany also is quite a young state. It's basically just only 2 years older than Ukraine, because before '89, this country had never existed in its current form. Right? It was totally different. Basically, the West Germany in the Cold War times, you could easily compare with the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, right? Though even more, I would say that throughout the 20th century, Ukraine has had more stable borders than Germany did, right? Strangely enough. But this DDR experience, I think this East German experience is particularly important because on the one hand, at least it's my kind of perception and feeling, that's the part of the country which had been under the Soviet occupation, right? And I think there is a kind of what perhaps might be called a kind of a Stockholm syndrome. That there is a constant fear of the Russians, in quotation mark, coming back. Because, I mean, we all know, I mean, in historical sense, what had been happening here. So there is this fear of Russians coming back. At the same time, after the so-called reunification, which some people refer to as colonization, maybe rightly so, it's up to you actually to find the proper term, there was this ressentiment feeling, right, which of course is very much fueling the AfD unfortunately rise in this part of the country. But I think it's not by occasion that Merkel herself was coming from the east, right? And after the occupation of Crimea, I had also, I remember this quite well, I had also this feeling that it was a kind of a policy of Zeitverschwendung, just wasting time. We have to wait. As if, because the DDR experience was imposed on the Ukrainian case. We just have to wait for a new Gorbachev after Putin to come. Because the Germans were allowed by the Soviets to liberate themselves, right? I mean, that we have to wait and then we will have a peaceful transition. to some normality. So we don't have to act. That's why actually, by the way, Nord Stream 2 took place. Then the second issue, which I was really, I have to say, 2.5 years ago, I was really very disappointed, having been working in Germany for like the last 15 years in many, mostly in the artistic realm, but still, I was really disappointed. It was precisely a discursive, on a discursive level. I mean, in particular here, this whole so-called rhetorics, which was coming from the Kremlin side, the rhetorics of the so-called denazification, right? I even cannot pronounce it with my own lips because it's an atrocity talk. I hate this. I want to vomit. I think this is just, it's such a crime, right? I mean, when they started to, Putin and all the guys, that talk about the denazification of Ukraine, I was really surprised. It was just a precursor to the real crime, right? Genocidal crimes that they committed throughout the last 2 years. But what I was really surprised, especially following a bit German public discourse, that it was not really reflected in Germany. Because the thing is that this type of, Marci mentioned memorial, and really this is so much important, because if you remember, you can check the dates, Putin closed down the memorial organization exactly on the same day when Merkel visited Moscow on her last official visit to Russia. It was spit at your face, at German face. All the things that are wrapped up as denazification is anti-German propaganda from the Kremlin side, of course, because they understand very well, not only the guy who was raised professionally in Dresden, but they know very well that Germany is a powerhouse of Europe, and in order to disrupt United Europe, the European Union, they have to disrupt Germany, and they know the key, they know the clue, right, how to disrupt you. And that's why they want to reverse and repurpose the Nazi defeat into disrupting, so it's a kind of an anti-Nuremberg, to stage another Nuremberg in order to get out your ground from your feet. And because if Germany is out, then Europe is obviously done. And thirdly, so I think this has been not really reflected in the German context, how anti-German this war actually is. This is against Ukraine, but it is profoundly anti-German. It's as an act, as an intention, because it's anti-European. That's why it's anti-German. Yeah, I think like from the Ukrainian perspective, this is totally clear. And thirdly, what I would refer to wrap it up and to leave some questions perhaps for the audience, is that we also have to take into account some deeper level, I would say, how much, which very much involves some imperial dimensions and some past colonialisms, and the connections between the Prussian and the Russian empires, right? And these Prussian-Russian connections, starting from Peter I and then Catherine II and stuff like that. So I think that there is a really kind of a coherence and interaction between the Russian world, Ruski Mir, and Deutsche Welt. Very much so, right? Because both ideas, conceptually speaking, as far as we can follow the archaeology of these political ideas, they both derive from anti-enlightenment, anti-rationality, anti-French Revolution, because revolution has been always the biggest problem for the German context, as you know very well as for the Russian one. That's why Putin officially proclaimed that 1917 October Revolution was coup d'etat, because that's the worst nightmare. That's why he attacked Ukraine, because of the Maidan Revolution, not to have the same in Russia. So this fear of the revolution is the biggest kind of an obscene basis for both imperial regimes that has been defining so much their development, and basically from this from there we also have this dichotomy between Kultur und Zivilisation. Yeah, so that the French, the Romans, the Brits, they represent this rationality, and here we have spirituality. That's also the concept that Germans or Prussians used to refer to, and that is the basic concept for the current Ruski Mir, Russian world idea. So and both were profoundly anti-Western, right? This anti-West as a kind of a basis for the ideological and political ressentiment. So, and even more today, right? The Kremlin intends to be a kind of a leader of this anti-Western ressentiment throughout what is so badly and totally in a misleading way called global South. Sorry for mentioning that. So I think that there are only two centers in Europe, really, like which are policing Europe, the whole continent, Berlin and St. Petersburg, and then Moscow, right? And everything in between are just lands. These are not, without any subjectivities, without any agency. These are just lands and some people there, so that we can rule. So I put a comma here, and sorry for being and give it to you.
Yeah, I will try to keep it very short, that we will still have some time for questions and comments. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a professor here at the university since 16 years. I'm working here. I'm political scientist, historian, half Polish, born and brought up in Germany and repolonized by my Polish wife. And I have a similar story. Since 2014 I haven't been to Russia. Since 2015 I haven't been to Belarus, where I had connections to the opposition. I can't go there, and I stopped my son 2 weeks ago to go to Belarus to visit his girlfriend in Minsk, which is dangerous right now. He can't do that. And of course I was a volunteer in the West German army, and I was a peacenik in the 90s, and I stopped to be a peacenik, so to speak, in 1998 in the occasion of Srebrenica, when Joschka Fischer, as the foreign minister, said, "No more Auschwitz." And I signed this till today, and I totally support your position. Maybe, of course, you mentioned this famous saying of Francis Fukuyama, "End of history." Of course, this was never true. We know this today, but of course, we were a little bit fascinated in the 90s by this, and we should focus. That we have not only two transitions after '89, that means a transition from planned economy to market economy, maybe a little bit too neoliberal in Central and Eastern Europe, I would say, and of course from authoritarian or totalitarian state to a liberal democracy, but also the reinvention of nation. And which is, sometimes it's good for social cohesion, and very often it's bad because it's dangerous. It's connected to xenophobia, racism, etc. And you mentioned Lviv. If we travel to Lviv, we see all these goals. We see the Jewish cemetery, we see a Polish cemetery, a Ukrainian cemetery. There are all more people, Armenians, etc. in the city. There's even Armenian cathedral in Lviv. And this is all over the region. This coming to terms with history is, of course, it's never possible. Every generation, you mentioned the Holocaust, every generation has to define its own attitude towards the Holocaust, and this is changing. And I liked your connection between guilt and responsibility. And I would say Germany still sticks in the political culture to the phenomena of guilt and to imperial traditions, what you said. Because maybe I would and could defend Prussia to a certain degree, but this is not the topic of today's evening. And we find, of course, opponents of enlightenment in the West, Edmund Burke and others. This would be once again a longer topic. And of course, in what you mentioned, both mentioned, in the Russian society, we still have some critics of Putin. It's hard to say how much of them there, because when I was in Yale, in my house in Bremen, were people from Memorial lived there for Harvey, who were kicked out of Russia. if you look at the German position, why is more guilt than responsibility? Because it's easier. No? Confronting the past must hurt. And it hurts if you really do it. There's some rules how to do domestic reconciliation, how to improve your relationship with your neighbors. We still, for example, if you look at the Poles and the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian state denies the exhumation of Polish victims of the genocide at the Poles in 1943 under German occupation. This is crazy because both countries are friends, I would say, but there's still no allowance of the Ukrainian state till today for the exhumation of these 80,000 Poles who were killed, 20,000 Ukrainians were killed roughly. Grzegorz Motyka at least said me these are the numbers. And of course, if we look, why Germany, you attended this strange conference in Moscow, where no Ukrainians were there, because the Germans perceive Russians since the 18th century as an equal partner in Europe. And the Ukrainians are not present there, and you are totally right. We apologize because the Soviet Union is Russia, and the atrocities on Belarusian soil, first and foremost, there was a very strong partisan movement there. Also, Jewish resistance, armed resistance in Belarus. The general governor of Belarus has been killed by Jewish freedom fighters. But the Germans look at Russia as equal and ignore other neighbors. When I deliver some speeches about Polish-German relationship, I always say Poles also liberated Germany from fascism. And the German spectators are always looking at me, this guy is crazy. But there was a Polish army coming from the east, invading Berlin with the Red Army, and there was a Polish army coming with Montgomery from the west, liberating Oberlangen, a very big concentration camp. And they're also ignoring Ukrainian history and Belarusian history, etc. They don't know the facts. And if we look at what was discussed since 22, of course, there was this famous Zeitwende, and of course we could, for good reasons, criticize the current government that it should deliver even more and do more, etc., and not just wait for the pikes of killed people. But it is still more, I would say, guilt than responsibility, because responsibility would mean support more confront Putin with his atrocities. He's a war criminal, of course. There can't be maybe a ceasefire, but real peace with Putin, I would say it's impossible. But of course, people are dying there, and not every Ukrainian planned to be a warrior 20 years ago. There are good reasons to have a different life. And the Germans, of course, because sometimes the discussion in Germany is pretty bizarre. It is sometimes a little bit selfish, of course, not among all parties, all political milieus. But the Germans were masters of war, and so now they are masters of peace sometimes, and of course they were masters of how to come to terms with history. And the German model, we are better in that, to come to terms with history, which is not true. Just look at different examples, and every society, I like the term society than nation. I would prefer society like Tönnies, a famous German sociologist from the 19th century. Every society has to decide how to come to terms with history. What ways of reconciliation, which Timothy Garton Ash 20 years ago described in an article for the Leviathan. I will stop here, because we have 25 minutes, less or more to go, and we should start maybe questions, comments. Don't be so shy. And both are probably, if you speak not too fast, to understand questions in German. Yeah. So you can also... O, in Polish, tak, możemy mówić po polsku, oczywiście bardzo dobrze. O, in Polish. If you're too cautious, I will, of course, ask Marci, because she makes her notes. Maybe she will deliver some additional comment. Take the mic, please.
Well, thank you both. Now I think we're talking about caution, and we're talking about lateness. We're talking about what it means to be too slow. And that's, Vasyl mentioned Hamlet, the time is out of joint, which is also something I think we've been feeling existentially, a kind of tear in time. Something tore in time on February 24th, 2022. There were 3 moments in my life when something happened on a world historical scale that I felt paralyzed by the feeling of time being torn. The first was on September 11th, 2001, when I was in New York. The second was in November 2016, when Trump won the election. and the third was February 24th, 2022, which in fact I was in New Haven, Connecticut at the time. So my time, it was not February 24th, but February 23rd. And moreover, I was awake because 4 a.m. Kiev time, which was 3 a.m. your time, was 9 o'clock in the evening New York time. And so we were all awake, and watching the news. And I couldn't absorb it. I felt literally as if time had been torn, and I was in this state of paralysis. And I'm not even Ukrainian. And since then, there's been this kind of surreal sense of lateness that I know Vasyl feels in his own skin. This is his country. But I've also, as an outsider, been watching and just tearing my hair out. How can it take us so long? Why this kind of dribbling out? Why this? I grew up in a Jewish community, so for me, this idea of asking, well, maybe there could be a ceasefire, or maybe there could be a negotiation about the borders. And I thought, could you have negotiated with the Nazis in 1945 to leave some part of the Jewish population under Nazi occupation? That's not a question about borders, it's a question about human beings. Do we have a moral right to leave people under a reign of terror? Can you leave people under a reign of terror? And perhaps because I know a lot of those people personally, it seems morally unsustainable to me. I'll also, maybe I'll just speak for a minute here as an American, which again I always feel a bit guilty about doing because Americans are incredibly self-absorbed. We think the whole world revolves around us, and everything important really comes from Washington. But I'll say something.
Ukrainians think so.
Ukrainians also think that. No, Americans are the first thing Europeans never understand about Americans is just the extent of our self-absorption. The extent to which, for most Americans, life that happens in other languages, in other countries, is not quite real. It's a huge country. It's a monolingual country. The fact that life is taking place other places is generally only very vaguely understood. But one thing I've been toying with writing about, especially in the past few weeks, since the missile attack on the center of Lviv. I don't know why that in particular, but a friend of both of ours in Lviv, Yurko Prohasko, texted me after that missile attack. And I had texted him and said, are you okay? I knew he lived right around there. And he texted me back in Polish and said, my family and I we're okay. We were lucky, but our neighbors next door, our friends, a mother and her 3 daughters are dead. And watching streamed that funeral of this woman who is my generation and her 3 daughters, and watching her husband watch the bodies of his wife and 3 daughters pulled out of that rubble and then presiding over that funeral. That for me was a kind of iconic image that burned in my brain that I couldn't calm down about. And the next day my husband left for Lviv, right as that funeral was taking place. And I was constantly in touch then with colleagues in Washington saying, how can we get the White House to lift the restrictions on using American weapons to strike targets inside Russia? Because that missile that hit Lviv, even though it was all the way in the west, was a missile that came from from inside Russia. And as you probably know, there are restrictions about using American weapons inside the Russian interior in fear of antagonizing or provoking Putin. And so in that sense, Ukrainians are just kind of helpless. They have the weapons, but they're not allowed to use them, waiting for these missiles to kind of come at them. And so I was brainstorming with politicians, with lobbyists, with political scientists, and everyone understood it's not a decision of Congress and it's not a decision of the national security agencies, it's a decision of the White House. It's President Biden's personal decision. And he was hesitating and he was vacillating. And what came back to me then, and now this part of the story is not only an American part of the story, but also a very generational story. And I don't know if most of you here are younger than I am, so I don't know that you'll remember this. But when I was 19 years old, there were congressional hearings to confirm the nomination to the Supreme Court of Clarence Thomas, who is currently on the Supreme Court. Who is a black American judge who was nominated by the Republicans for the Supreme Court. And as part of the background check to confirm that nomination, there were interviews with all sorts of people who had worked with him. One of them was a then young woman named Anita Hill, who was also a black American attorney, a young woman who had worked for Clarence Thomas, who was by then a law professor at the university, who when interviewed or when questioned, said that he had sexually harassed her. She hadn't volunteered to come forward, but when questioned, she said that. And then there were hearings in the American Congress about her claims that she had been harassed sexually by Clarence Thomas and his denial. You can now pull these up on the internet. You can pull them up, the transcripts. At the time, it was pre-internet. It was October 1991. I was 19. I was at college. I didn't have a television, but I had a radio. So I was listening on the radio. So I couldn't even see the people who were playing this out, but I was listening to it. And Joe Biden was the chairman who presided over these hearings. And every ridiculous person that poor Anita Hill ever, perhaps had dated or went to dinner with was then paraded out to humiliate her and to portray her as a woman who just had fantasies about men being interested in her. And Joe Biden was presiding over this. And again, I didn't even know what he looked like at the time, but I can still hear his voice. And when I went back and read the transcripts now, I was astounded to find how much of them I remembered verbatim, because it just implanted itself in my head. It was a kind of coming-of-age feminist moment for me. And I understood at the time, listening to him, that he believed her. And he was cringing at her humiliation. But he was unable to kind of get outside of the role that he had been put in, to step outside of that box and take some decisive action that would have changed the situation. There was a path dependence and a kind of moderation. And you can hear in his voice the tension. You can hear that he's a fundamentally decent human being, and he believes this woman. And he can't stand that these men are humiliating her. But he's not going to be able to take the action that he needs to take to fundamentally shift the paradigm. And we are, by the way, living with the consequences of that today, because Clarence Thomas was confirmed on the Supreme Court. He is one of the people, who voted to give Trump immunity this summer, which is basically a 1933-like position, profoundly anti-democratic. He is one of the people, who overturned Roe versus Wade and overturned abortion rights in the States. The fact that Joe Biden then, even though it was not what he wanted, was unable to take decisive action, has tragic consequences that we're living with today. And I see him now in the White House, and I see him looking at Putin, and I see him looking at Zelensky. He knows what's right and what's wrong. He knows that Putin is evil. He knows what's happening in Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to win. He can't stand the fact that these people are being killed, but he's unable to take the kind of decisive act. He's unable to take the risk, to go back to this idea of risk. He's unable to fundamentally get out of this belatedness, get out of this incrementalism, and radically shift the paradigm at the moment when he needs to. And that kind of extraordinary continuity over 30 years is striking me as a tragic flaw of a man who I think is fundamentally decent. It's a long story.
Yeah, I would just, though I'm not a historian myself, but when I try to look at the current predicament, the current moment in time, as if it's already gone, or like trying to analyze it as a past event, I just really hope that I will have enough years in my life to be able to do so sometime soon. What really strikes me, I think, is a kind of even on the level of a metaphor, it's a kind of a paradox that since this war is a European war, of course, it's just that the weakest country is being under attack. But what really strikes me most, that so huge amount of work has been done since 45, right, throughout the whole continent, but also in general in Eurasia, if you wish, right? It's like so many efforts, finances, structures, juridical mechanisms, institutions, new societies emerged. Just unbelievable amount of dedication to overcome that. And still, some 80 years afterwards, Western, especially European financial and political elites have been pumping huge amount of assets and resources to help this regime to come into being, which, I mean, of course, the Kremlin regime, the current Russian regime, which at the end of the day decided to stage the same war as it was 80 years ago and openly proclaimed that, even on TV, that this war is basically stylized and conducted on the Second World War scale, with the same purpose. And paradoxically, at the same time, this war is being fought on the same territory. Isn't it? I mean, this is like a kind of a absolutely schizophrenic kind of paradox, that so many efforts have been made to come to the same point, and even more, that this war is only rhetorically being referred to the Second World War, but in reality it's very much the First World War. It much more reminds the outlines, the depictions of Erich Maria Remarque's, right, from the front lines, with so many ugly realities like piles of corpses, the trenches and stuff like that, the same deadlock in military terms and so on. So this is like really what strikes me most, how I think it will be really, in some, by future historians, it will be referred to as a kind of perhaps it's not just how do you call it, Lust auf Mord, yeah, this kind of willingness to kill or to commit a crime, but it's as if some really in psychological perhaps terms some willingness to commit certain suicide. It's just because the weakest part of the chain has been so much profoundly attacked, but yeah, I think in a way we are out of. It's not just the time is out of joint. I think in a way we are out of time. Maybe we cannot keep the pace. I think it's already. I mean, something has been profoundly lost, and this is not. It's irreparable. To a certain extent. So, I mean, I of course don't represent officially any kind of Ukrainian organization or the Ukraine as a state. But I mean, something has been so profoundly lost, and it's not just what is, what has been happening inside the country with the Ukrainian society, with Ukraine as a country, due to the war and because of the war. I mean, but it's also what is happening to all of you and all of us, as I'm here, just watching the war from the other side of the fence, right? It's also, it's not just something that you watch at. It also has very profound consequences. Also here, it just seems that we are so distant. But especially in this country, we know what is the main result of allowing this to happen. We know the answer, right? It consists just of, it's a very short acronym. The first letter starts with the first letter in the alphabet.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'm not. Of course, if we look at the current war in Ukraine. It's easy to be pessimistic, and you described the reactions of Biden. I also would say he's a decent man, but he's for what reason ever afraid. Situation in German politics is a little bit different. The chancellor has to take into consideration parts of his party, parts of the population in Eastern Germany, always due to some political reasoning. And you mentioned in your lecture Francis Fukuyama, end of history. For sure, it was not the end of history then, but it is a turning point right now. And you mentioned the chronotopos. It's a chronotopos, a concept of Bakhtin. It's a chronotopos of thresholds. Now is the situation where we have to decide. Otherwise, it might be now the end of history. The end of the moral integrity, if such thing exists, of course, of democracy. Because democracy stands for human rights, for enlightenment, and we have everywhere in the world, also in the United States, in Poland, in France, etc., critics of enlightenment, and saying we have our own tradition, enlightenment is a moral disaster, etc. I totally disagree with that, but we have to defend the achievements of enlightenment. That means human rights, and human rights are violated right now. A guy like Putin should stand in front of a international court, of course. And the question which we can't answer today, how to end this mass and this brutal war, because I would say you can't negotiate peace with Putin. The best is ceasefire, which would stop killing, but there will be no peace with Putin. It's not possible. Never, I would say. But also, I like Kara Mirza, who said, I believe Russia will be democratic. Not today, not tomorrow. It will take a lot of time. And of course, this is not my problem today. My problem is today how to strengthen Ukraine to survive this war and to win this war. And maybe last sentence, the Chancellor never said in public Ukraine should win the war. He always says Russia shouldn't win the war, which is also a mistake, I would say. I look at my wristwatch, I look at the public, and maybe finally some comment or questions. Not really.
why do you believe that Russia could be democratically doubting the same word? Because like I think, I mean, in my as an Ukrainian, I really feel like Russia should cease to exist, rather than like to, you know, praise the idea that like Russia one day will become democratic. When it becomes democratic,
No, first of all, yeah, sure. First of all, I don't think that it is in your genetics that you can't become democratic. This is banal and simple, sure. No? Second, of course, Russia is an empire, and an empire should be undergo decomposition, because we have all this in the Caucasus, Chechnya, in Siberia, etc. And political science always would say this would be dangerous if Russia will be dismembered and collapse, etc. I don't know. And of course, I come from Jerzy Giedroyc, who was a Polish emigre living in Paris, and he developed this together with another guy, Juliusz Mieroszewski, a concept of Eastern policy. And he said, we have to do everything that Ukraine becomes democratic, and Belarus and Russia, and Lithuania, of course. And Belarus was for a short period of time, for 5 years, democratic. Russia for maybe 10 years, and Ukraine since, I would say, 20 years, roughly, since the first revolution there. And I guess it's the only solution. How to achieve it? This is very demanding and very difficult how to do it, because it's a decision of the Russian society. Don't forget that it's the biggest political emigration since the Bolshevist revolution from Russia. The biggest, 100,000 of people. These are not all clear-cut Democrats, because if Russia won't become democratic, it will be dangerous for you, for Moldova, for the Baltics, for Poland. So it's my wish, and I loved Navalny, who was not always a Democrat, by the way, but he sacrificed his life finally, and they are decent people. Also, all of this. Russia has to lose the war to win the democracy for Russia and for the better future of Russian soldiers who are also dying there.
Yeah, just get ready for more blood.
Yeah.
I think the question was short. Just do you believe this theology, like that Russia can evolve with some, it doesn't, the ecological project doesn't have this end to the violence as the Russians. Do you really?
We know in the case of Germany there was this famous unconditional surrender. The Nazis offered what you mentioned, offered to fight again, together with the Americans and the British against the Soviet army. Totally crazy. I personally would demand unconditional surrender of Russia, but this is totally an illusion. It never won't come to that. It's up to the Russian society to find ways out of that. So they have to topple Putin, and it will be very tough. I have no idea when this will happen, but I would say it's the only solution for peace for Russia and its neighbors. But this won't happen in the next years.
Maybe I'll just add that I also, and I'm a historian, historians are really only good at telling you what has already happened. We're not very good at telling you what will happen tomorrow. All we can tell you on the basis of the past is that anything is possible. There are 140 million people in Russia. They're not going to disappear. Something has to happen. Whether it's 16 different countries, whether it's one country, whether it's two countries, something has to happen. They're not going to magically go away in the air. But I also, my intuitive sense is that there needs to be complete and total defeat. It needs to be a 1945 kind of moment. There needs to be a radical reset. And I say this not only as somebody who is very close to Ukraine, but also as somebody who cares about Russia. I think the only hope for Russia and for Russians is a total defeat. And I think the people the people like Lena Kostuchenko and Vladimir Karamurza, they want that too. They understand the only chance for Russians is total defeat. Maybe I'll just add something that will seem obvious, but in last March I was in Kiev with my friend Amelia Glazier, who is a Slavicist who I went to graduate school with. It was the first big trip we'd taken together in like 2 decades. And we had been young graduate students in the 90s running around Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, reading Mayakovsky poems with great passion and studying Slavic languages. And now we were in Kiev, and during one morning we were there just between 3 and 6 a.m., as you can probably imagine. The Russians sent 31 cruise and ballistic missiles just to Kiev, just in that 3-hour period. And Amelia and I were in this bomb shelter. But as cowardly Americans, we immediately go to the bomb shelter. Lots of Ukrainians decide to take their chances. But we, every time the air raid alarm went off, we went to the bomb shelter. So we spent those 3 hours in the bomb shelter, and which is something I could not have imagined when we were in our 20s running around the archives in St. Petersburg and Vilnius, reciting Mayakovsky poems. I could not have imagined that as middle-aged Jewish mothers, we would be in a bomb shelter in Kiev, sending frantic messages back to Washington, pleading with politicians to immediately send lethal aid to Ukraine. That was very surreal. But when we came out that particular morning, I asked an Austrian diplomat friend, I said, just out of curiosity, how much did those 31 missiles cost? All 31 of which, by the way, were shot down by Ukrainian air defense. So those 31 missiles, just on that one morning we happened to be there, that was $390 million worth of missiles. Just pure nihilistic destruction. All of which were just pure, for nothing, absolutely for nothing. And Arad, my Austrian diplomat friend, texted back and he said, Marci, do you know how many schools you could build in Russia for that kind of money? In a country where millions of people don't have indoor plumbing, you spend $390 million in one morning just to bomb Kiev, and just the sheer nihilism of it is mind-boggling.
But you don't feel it in Moscow, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I mentioned my son and the girlfriend of my son who is from Belarus, and she toured as a pianist to Samara, and she told us that everywhere you see people handicapped with no legs, etc., but you don't see it in Moscow. No? And this is a crucial difference. And the powerhouse is in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and not in the provinces. No? And the percentage of people dragged to war and to the slaughterhouse, no, are from the provinces and from ethnic minorities. No? Sure, no? It has to come to a decomposition of the empire, no? Because the empires are evil, no? Unfortunately.
This has to be added, especially and emphasized, very openly, because apart from attempting to conduct a genocidal attempt onto Ukraine, the Kremlin regime is doing the same inside Russian so-called federation itself, right? Because they are just taking people from all the indigenous people, mostly, into the war in order just to eliminate them, right? In order to have a Russian majority in the country without any potential danger of any kind of subversion and diversion from the main line, and this is basically like on both sides that this genocidal attempt is taking place, and basically all of these indigenous people from these so-called republics or autonomous districts, mostly them, they are going through the war machinery, which is crazy. I mean, now, for instance, in Tuva, they basically even already lost even the majority of the indigenous people there, right? So it's just they simply disappear in the current Russian regime, right? So Putin, by the way, Putin's politics in terms of language issues, one of the first things that he implemented when he became president officially at the beginning of in 2000, right, was the prohibition and of the demand to at the secondary schools to teach local languages. That's sort of, it's basically because pretty often in the West people perceive through the media optics that he is trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union. It's much more worse than the Soviet times. It's unbelievably worse because it has never been the case in the Soviet times whatsoever. Right? Ukraine was independent, I mean, of course, in the framework, but it was a separate republic in the Soviet times. And it has never been the case that all the local languages in the current Russian Federation are basically forbidden. You cannot buy books, you cannot learn them at schools. So it's like a total annihilation. So it's really an nihilism, right? For no reason, basically, but it's just kind of a machinery which is hollowing out its own sort of soil, right? And what remains, basically, it's a typical kind of very old-fashioned, old-style, typical imperial mechanism, right? Which is just depriving people of themselves and killing them at the end of the day, right? And just to have an empty territory, to have other settlements there, and it's so cruel and so crazy that it's just really unbelievable in the 21st century. But this country is also called the Russian Federation, and this is the biggest lie because it has you can call it whatever you want, but it has never been a federation in history. Right? Germany is a federation, but Russia has never been a federation. Literally never, right? I mean, never. And it's not at the moment, obviously. Right? It cannot. It's not ruled as a federation.
More comments or questions after this positive end? Yeah, I would propose we stop here the official part and we can have some small talk, and maybe then we are more open to question and comment and have a beer or what else they offer at the bar.